Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Introduction to Metadata Part 1, or Metadata Basics Part 1, being offered by the Sunshine State Digital Network today. Just a few housekeeping items. This session is being recorded, so keep that in mind with any comments or anything that you're adding to the chat. You can post questions in the chat at any time. We will be saving questions until the end of the presentation, but feel free to pop those in at any time in the chat so you don't forget them. I've also enabled live transcription. So if you would like to see captions on your screen for the presentation, just click on the CC button or the live transcript button that's at the bottom of your Zoom window. And I think that's it. So without further ado, I will introduce our speakers for today. So our first speaker today will be Xiying. She is the metadata librarian for digital collections at the University of South Florida in Tampa. And I am Keila Zayas Ruiz, and I am the Sunshine State Digital Network Coordinator at Florida State University. Unfortunately, we were planning to have Elliot Williams also presenting today. But Elliot is now at the University of Texas, or at the Texas Digital Library, so he's no longer with the Sunshine State Digital Network. We miss him dearly. Today we will be providing a very basic beginner introduction to metadata, and Xiying will be covering what metadata is, why we create it, and how to create it at a very basic level. And then I'll be talking about some of the more common digital library schemas that are used in digital libraries. So I will pass it off to Xiying.
Thank you, Keila. Good morning, everyone. I turned on my video just to say hi. And then during the presentation, I'm going to turn off my video to save some bandwidth. So as Keila said, we're going to do a basic introduction of metadata today. I'm going to work through the 3 questions. What is metadata? Why to create a metadata? And how to create a metadata? Hopefully by answering those 3 questions, we got a basic understanding of metadata concept. So let's get started. What is metadata? If we do a Google search for metadata definition, then chances are we will find the answer that metadata is data about data. That is to say, metadata is a set of data that describes and gives information about other data. So data is simply the content, and the metadata describes the relevant information about that piece of content. So metadata is considered processed data that gives meaning to data. Next slide, please. Thank you. One more click, maybe. There. Thank you. So here I have an example. I took this screenshot right before our meeting started. It has our names on it, and it has a few images of our faces on it. Let's say I'm going to save this image in my folder where I archive all of my activities with SSDN. Now, before I save this image, I created this on the right. I created this piece of short record to accompany this image, because in a few years, I may not remember what happened in the image and why I took the screenshot. So this piece of short record tells me that this image is the participant list for an SSDN metadata training session that happened on October 28th, 2021. The meeting was an online Zoom session. So in this case, this image itself is the data, is the content, and the record is the metadata for the image, for the content. So the metadata record It is describing the data. It provides meaning and context to this data. So I hope now I have explained this, this concept clearly. So please help me out and give me some examples of data and metadata in the chat. It can be anything from your work, from your life, anything you can think of that's demonstrating data and metadata. Let's see. Do I have chat here? Yes. Yeah, please type in something. Tell me that you know that's an example of data and metadata in your life. On top of my head, I can think of a playlist of songs that I listen to when I go to work. Yes, music. Thank you. Yeah, a playlist will be like your little database, and each song is a piece of data. And then you have your maybe your player. Yes, book club, journals of book reads. Yes, yeah, that's a good example. Anything else? Would be a data and the metadata kind of relationship. Photos, yes. Yeah, like you have probably location and the date you took that photo, which that piece of metadata is describing your photo, your data. Right. Those are excellent examples. Now, it looks like we kind of already grasped that idea of data and metadata. Let's jump into our next slide and think about our second question, why we want to create metadata. Think about it. If a piece of data lives in a database, it wants and needs to be found, right? And that's the whole purpose of creating a database. So metadata provides access points to a piece of data when you search a database. For example, in any library, there oftentimes are thousands of printed books and serials, and a few dozens of thousands of ebooks and millions of articles. Now, how do we navigate through such a large pool of data? Well, that's where metadata can help. We create metadata catalog records to label the data, to identify the data, and then we find the data. Metadata allows users to search for data and filter data and access data and finally properly use data. Here, Keila is showing my example. If I want to find something in the library that's music score and it contains a keyword library. So in the search box, I typed in library, and on the left, I use the facet type where I select score there. Yeah, I do get a lot of results on my next, if you click one more time, Keila, yes. See, I have a lot of results, which is okay because my search was not that specific. What I wanted to show here is how this data gets to show up for the search. Let's look at the details. Yes. See, in the title, it has my search keyword library in it. And down here in the type field, it clearly says this is a record. So if we label our data property, that's how we give them access points and allows it to be found. So the very first reason to create metadata is to enable the discoverability of data. And secondly, our next slide, yes. We want to connect items that have some kind of relationships together. For example, there are two versions of breakfast at Tiffany's. We definitely want to link them together so that the users will see them at one stop and they can pick and choose which version to look at. And in my second example at the bottom of the slide, this is a piece of metadata from a book chapter. Now, this book chapter belongs to this whole book, right? We want to connect this whole book with the chapter together. And then when the users look at the chapter, they will be able at the same time access the book if they should be interested in that book as well. So another common example we can think of is periodicals with multiple issues. In all of those cases, we want to reflect the structure in the metadata. So users will have easier access and to the content, and will get a better organization of the information. Metadata gives the professionals the platform to record those relationships and organize them in an efficient way, so that items in a compound object can be found and accessed at all levels. The third major role of metadata is to support users to successfully and properly use an item. Metadata tells what format a specific item is in and what supply you might need to be able to use the item. For example, in this record on the screen, the item is a video disc. To be able to watch it, users will have to have a video disc player. Similar things can be found for computer files records, where certain computer programs are needed to open the files. Besides the technical needs to use an item, copyright statements or Creative Commons statements for items are important as well. They suggest to users to what extent they can use or reuse the item. And using the materials properly keeps our users out of trouble, and it protects the intellectual property from misuse. Now, the fourth reason to create and maintain good quality metadata is to support item preservation, especially long-term preservation. We know that in the digital era, technology advances rapidly. Also, we sometimes migrate our collections from system to system for various reasons. In those situations, we want to preserve our digital assets to make sure that they are usable and do not get obsolete. This is where metadata can be helpful too. Metadata keeps good track of the file formats and the structure of the data, so that whenever we need to move our data from one system to another, or we need to convert the access to the item, we have a very good record of the background history, and we'll have enough information to process the data properly to protect them from getting obsolete. For example, in the image on the screen, we can tell that the metadata has recorded that this item is an image, and its size is in the red box at the very top. And it has 3 different formats, that's TIFF, JPEG, and JP2, and their checksums are available as well. This is very handy whenever we need to migrate the item. Okay. Wait. Yeah. On top of support the local use of the collections, another important aspect of creating metadata is to support data shareability. One of the digital repository's missions is to support digital collections harvested by other institutions or by data aggregators, such as SSDN and DPLA. These aggregators collect contributions from their participants and create one bigger platform for them, which benefits both the users and the participating institutions. Users get the one-stop shop experience on those platforms. And since the aggregators have put together collections from multiple institutions, the content provided through their platform can be more subject-specific and subject-enriched compared to just one single institution. For the participants, their collections get a larger audience, and oftentimes the distributed collections will be brought together to complete each other. With all of these benefits, it's very popular for one institution to seek the partnership with an aggregator. In these collaborations, metadata is playing the role of providing the context for the data and creating a link between the aggregator and its participants. Here is an example. This image on the very top is from USF, but it was harvested and displayed on DPLA website. The metadata in the red boxes tells that this image is a cigar box label, and it also marked that the image comes from USF. And at the bottom, here's the link that can bring the users back to USF digital repository directly. Well, this image is one of the items in our Tampa cigar industry and art collection. If you encounter this image under the collection, you can easily tell that it's a cigar box label and it's part of USF digital repository. But once it's harvested, the item lost its original umbrella of the repository and the collection. If the metadata does not tell it's a cigar box label and it's from USF, it will be hard for any users to understand what the image is and where it lives. With the link back to USF collection, users can also easily find another couple thousands of cigar labels if they're just doing cigar label research. So here I made a short list of different kinds of metadata and their functions. We have covered all of these types of metadata so far. The descriptive metadata is the metadata we see most often on a library catalog. Structural metadata deals with organizing items in compound objects and maintains the relationships among items. Administrative metadata tracks the data history and the rights information. Technical metadata records digital assets file type and the information needed for long-term preservation. Till here, you may say, oh, how come I've never seen so many different metadata? Well, that's right, because not all of the metadata is for public displaying purposes. A lot of them are hidden from the public review only for professionals to work from the back end of the system. The ones in the light orange boxes are oftentimes hidden only for back-end use. I also want to make it clear that different organizations have different ways to define metadata types. For example, if you look into NISO, they define metadata types different than Getty. I just want to make sure that we all know that it's not a unified definition. All right, let's jump to our third question. So how to create metadata? Before creating metadata, we need to observe our objects to understand that piece of data thoroughly. Different materials need different metadata to reflect its content, its access, and its usability. For example, we just saw the cigar box label. When we are looking at an artwork like that, we'd be interested in knowing, what techniques used in it, what year it was made, or what colors are showing on the label. But if we're looking at a text document, we'll probably be looking for, authors or editors of it and the year it was written. And if we're looking at an old photo of Tampa, we'd be interested in knowing, specifics, geographic location, coordinates maybe, and the time it was taken, the photo was taken. If we're looking at a music performance, we'd be thinking about, the instruments used for the performance or the performance medium. Those are all very different metadata fields, and they can be from different metadata schema. So the first step to create a metadata record is to understand your materials and find out all the valuable aspects of the material and have them represented in your metadata. There is no one metadata standard fits all, so we all have to be respectful with our materials and use the metadata tools that best fit the material. And then after examining the individual object, we need to examine its collection, how other items in the collection has been cataloged, and what is the local protocols for the collection, what is the protocols and standards across the field. And if there is established local best practice, we'll have to follow it. And finally, we need to think from the user's point of view. Who are the target users? Children and young readers are different from adults. Researchers are different from community users, who are just viewing. And how the users are retrieving and use the data. If we are working with a collection of dime novels and targeting the young users, we need to be aware of their search preference and information-seeking habits. Maybe we just add a couple more topic-specific subject headings that's more helpful for them. If we're working with a collection of historic photos of a city, and I think that the historians may be the major users, date and the geographic locations are definitely key information to provide. In the case that there is a partnership project where the partner is providing the data and we will need to provide the metadata, we need to work with them closely, especially with the data creator and the contributor. We need to understand what is the most valuable aspect of the data for them and make effort to show that aspect because it could be something that their peers in the field are looking for too. All right, after collecting all the information we need, we now know everything about item, its collection, its users. Now we can sit down and create a metadata record. Well, the first thing to remember is to follow standards. No matter what standards you choose, it can be RDA and MARC and Library of Congress vocabularies, or it can be VRA core and Getty vocabularies. Your choice of standards really depends on your content, but once you choose a standard, stick with it as much as possible. Following standards makes our metadata valuable because it supports metadata to be usable and interoperable. In some cases, it's inevitable that we have to make some local adjustments, then be consistent about our practice and document our practice, because highly likely you will not be the only person to create metadata for that collection in that repository. Once there are other people getting on board, the local practice document gives them a good starting point and a good guidance. That way, the metadata in your repository will be nice and clean and efficient, and your users and your successors and your aggregators will all thank you. Secondly, create your metadata to be as complete as possible, because your item may be harvested by other institutions or researchers. They are maybe findable through a Google search. You want your item to be self-explanatory, even standing alone with just its metadata record. Sorry for background noise. Well, users don't need to dig into its collection to understand what is happening, who is participating, where and when the event has happened in the item. Each piece of data will make sense and be able to show its value without their original collection and umbrella and repository umbrella. And thirdly, create records to be both human readable and machine readable. Data harvesting, aggregating, and data visualization activities are one important aspects a digital repository is supporting. Create human and machine readable records is much needed. Again, we have to follow protocols and standards to make our records that way, especially for the records to be machine readable. So I feel when it comes to creating metadata, it's never too much to stress for following the protocols and standards. Well, lastly but not least, that when we create metadata, we need to always keep in mind that we should our metadata should represent the content respectfully and inclusively. All right, that's my presentation so far, but now I want to do a quick exercise. Okay, this is a piece of text. If you have to create metadata for this text, what information would you put in your metadata records? Please chat that. Yeah, put that into chats so we can all read, and maybe discuss. This is Tampa Times, and it's from USF Digital Repository. Date, right? Title of the publication, perfect. Yeah, newspaper title, edition. Do we have edition for newspaper? Headlines, good. Title, date, photos, names, excellent. Newspaper title, date, yes, absolutely, absolutely. Those are great key information topic. Topic, interesting. What kind of topic are you thinking? Because on just one piece of newspaper, they can have different pieces of news on there, can be of different location, can be of different topics. Drafts, Peace Corps there, perfect. Publisher, yes, for sure. Excellent, that's great. Those are all key information to be able to, for users to search for this piece of newspaper. Very good. Okay, let's move on to our next exercise. I have an image. Yeah, those are some beautiful flamingos. If you are going to create metadata for this image, what would you put in your record? Photo elements, size, color. Yeah, black, white. Subject of photo. Okay, excellent. Location, yes. Flamingos, yeah. Location, date, if we can find date. I don't see dates. I'm hoping, I'm hoping on the back of the physical photo, they have a date written there, so we can transcribe that into our metadata record. Description, excellent. Why do we need to have descriptions? One time, one person asked me when she was working with a photo collection, so she asked me, why do I need to create text descriptions of an image? Anybody has any thoughts on why we need to have descriptions for photo? If people see it, they'll just see it. Why we need to use words to describe it? Accessibility, yes. Photographer, copyright information, very key information, yes. Format, yes, digital or analog. Excellent. So circle back to my description question. Anybody have any thoughts why we need to create description for image? Metadata should explain item without visual. Excellent, that's right. Perfect. Also, think about people search. If people are just searching flamingo, you want them to be able to use words to search your photo, otherwise they're not searchable. Exactly. Dictionary for the image to be able to search content of photo. Exactly meaning that's correct. All right, let's go move on to our third exercise, video and audio. What do you think? What would be the key information? Other than we just all wanna lay in the pool and have iced drink in our hands. Need a good description, yeah. Technical format information, yes. If it's MP4 or if something duration, excellent. Subject, for sure, yes. Good. Anything else? Do we want a title? If it's a movie, do we want them to know the director? Do you want to know, of course, description, definitely. Anything else you can think of? Yes, duration is one thing that's very special for video and audio. All right. that's the time that I have. I hope it's some helpful information. Now I'll just turn it over to Keila, and she's going to talk about the schemas. Thank you all.
Hello, everyone. I am going to talk about some digital library schemas that are commonly used in a lot of digital library systems and across different types of organizations. But before we get started, I would like to add a disclaimer here. So I understand that it can be really easy to get bogged down trying to fully understand a schema. But I don't want you to get like wrapped up in the details of that. It's really not too important to understand all of the details of a schema before you begin creating your metadata. Your system will generally have the necessary elements for you to complete your metadata easily. It's going to have forms, it's going to have the structure available to you, and it's going to try to make it as easy as it can. Most systems are going to try to make it easy as it can be to get started with whatever schema they use. The schemas that we're going to be discussing today are all very well documented, and they all have really great supplemental resources and examples available online to reference if you find that you have questions after you begin creating your metadata. Many metadata professionals will reference these, even those who have been creating metadata for years and years. There's always something that you might need to reference, and there's no shame in going back and looking it up, as we are information professionals. That is something that we're used to doing. And there are at times going to be updates to these schemas, and those are generally also very well documented for your reference. So anytime an update comes out, you should be they should be easily findable on the documentation for these, as well as previous versions are also generally accessible on these sites, so that you can look back at past practice as well and past recommendations for those schemas. The most important thing to remember when deciding on or using a specific schema is to be consistent in your metadata creation and to document your decisions and processes as you go. So as Xiying mentioned already, that the documentation is really important, and any successors that you have or anyone else that's working on these projects with you is going to thank you for having very good documentation when it comes to any type of metadata creation. So if you ever change your mind, you need to make any corrections, or you're migrating or sharing your metadata to another system that might use a different schema, these practices of consistency and documentation will ensure an easier transition in any of those cases. So make sure that you keep old documentation as well. You don't just want to have the most current version. You want to make sure to date any changes that you make to your documentation or your practice. That way it's easier to track when decisions were made to change things, and you can more easily identify different legacy metadata and why certain things might look the way that they do when you're going back. And then also, as Xiying already mentioned, the correct use of schemas is going to be interoperable, and it's going to allow for both people and machines to read and interpret your metadata. So it's extremely important to adhere to protocols and standards as you're doing this, even if those protocols and standards are local practice. If you document those and you remain consistent with those standards and protocols, even if they are local, it will be really important for both the human users and the machine users of your metadata. So that's just something I wanted to start off with before we get into schemas, because they can be quite complicated. I'm not going to get too granular today, but that's just something to keep in mind. You don't have to be an expert in these. There's a lot of documentation you can reference at any stage in your creation process. Okay, so first, what is a schema? Metadata schemas outline a common understanding of what data are composed of, so the elements or attributes of data, and they are used for the purpose of describing data. So it's important to think about what the difference between metadata and schemas is. So as Xiying explained, metadata is data about data, but schemas are the structure and layout of that data. So how that information is organized. So a real world example, as we talked about a little bit earlier, of metadata is when you take a picture and your phone saves the information like the date, the location of where that picture was taken. And then a real world example of a schema is the layout of a website. So how that information is organized on a particular system. So the first schema that we're going to be talking about today is Dublin Core. And Dublin Core is a metadata initiative that was, or schema that was created in the early 2000s. It's maintained by the Dublin Core Metadata Initiative. It's called Dublin Core because it was created at a conference in Dublin, Ohio. So it doesn't have anything to do with Ireland, unfortunately, but it is named for the place where it was developed. There are 15 elements included in Dublin Core. It's a very, very flexible and interoperable schema. It's used very widely in libraries and outside of libraries for a lot of different types of content. There are no required elements that you have to use in your records, but you do have to use at least one. Generally, that might be a title or something like that, or maybe a link to something, but you do have to have at least one element, but none of the other ones are required to complete a record necessarily. And every single element in Dublin Core is repeatable, which can be very useful because one of the things that you want to avoid when creating metadata is stacking. And stacking is something where you add multiple values into one field. And you want to avoid doing that because it makes it very difficult for people to read that and for machines to read that. So repeating that element allows you to add that multiple values to something like multiple subject headings or multiple authors without putting all that information into one field and packing that, which can make it really difficult, again, for users and computers. And I've also included on this slide a link to the Dublin Core site where all the documentation lives and any news and updates that they put out. We will be sending these slides out to you, but I have included the documentation links for all of the schemas we're talking about today on their slides. Okay, so what are the elements that are included in Dublin Core? So again, there are 15 elements. And those are contributor, coverage, creator, date, description, format, identifier, language, publisher, relation, rights, source, subject, title, and type. And I have, there's a little definition there for what each one of those is referring to. In all cases, you want to refer to the original object and not the digital surrogate for the most part. As she mentioned, you can include that information in some of your technical metadata, like what the file format is that you've saved an image in, or if a text is a PDF file or something else, that can be stored in your technical metadata. But when it comes to filling out these specific elements, you want to think again about the intention of the user and your audiences. So what are they looking for? And always try to refer to the original item that you're describing. So we're going to take a look at an example of a simple Dublin Core record. I hope everyone can see this. So when it comes to a Dublin Core record, again, not all of the elements are required. So as we can see, this one is a very simple record. This has a title, which is Eucolon. It has a description, and then it has a publisher and a link, which is the identifier. So this is a very simple record. It doesn't have any repeated fields, and it doesn't have all of the elements included in it. But this is what it would look like as an XML encoded version of a Dublin Core record. Now, Dublin Core does also allow for encoding in other formats like HTML, but the most common that you're going to see on the back end of a system or in an aggregator is going to be the XML encoded version. And while it can look kind of complicated, it is pretty human readable as well as machine readable because the labels are very simple and don't rely on numbers or anything like that that might be confusing. So the benefits of Dublin Core or using Dublin Core is that it is a very simple structure. It's really, really easy to use. It's not overly complicated. It doesn't necessarily rely on a lot of authorities or anything like that. You can use a lot of different vocabularies with Dublin Core. So it's very simple. It's great for describing simple resources. You can really describe almost anything with a Dublin Core record. And it's really great for metadata sharing across domains and discovery layers. Because of its simple format, it's very easy to map Dublin Core to other systems. It's also what the Open Archives Initiative protocol for metadata harvesting and sharing. It's very compliant with that. So again, that cross-platform sharing, it's compliant with that standard that is used to share information across library platforms for when Google's indexing something or something like that. And it's one of the most common default schemas that's used by many, many digital library platforms. It's also used by websites, museum software, things like that. So it's one of the most commonly used schemas, and a lot of systems that is the default, what it's based on for its metadata structure. So what are some of the limitations of Dublin Core? So there's no way right now to distinguish a main title from a subtitle in Dublin Core, in simple Dublin Core. It's, you can lose a lot of granularity when you're using just basic simple Dublin Core. It doesn't really allow for a lot of specifics. There's a way to specify creator roles. So you add a creator, there's no way to know if that's a photographer or a writer or, you know, some other kind of creator, painter, something like that. So you can't really specify the relationship of the creator to that work. The same thing with contributor, it's just contributor. There's no way to associate what kind of contribution that person or organization had to the creation of that item. So you can lose some of that granularity and specificity that will help you establish relationships. And it doesn't provide the ability for robust record relationships on its own. You can add other schemas to supplement Dublin Core. That can make things more complicated, but it doesn't do a very good job on its own when it comes to things like compound objects that Xiying was mentioning earlier. So things like a scrapbook or a postcard that has a front and back or something like that, that might need some additional description associated with it. Dublin Core is not very good at handling those kinds of relationships and structure because it is a very simple format. This is a word of warning to everybody. The inconsistent use of fields can make Dublin Core extremely unwieldy. And so that simplicity and that flexibility that is primarily a benefit can cause issues if you're not consistent. I'm going to say that in every metadata presentation that I'm ever going to give. Consistency is the most important thing that you can do when creating metadata and documenting your practices so that you can remain consistent. Because I've seen Dublin Core migrations that have been very difficult because of the inconsistent use of elements, which make it very difficult to map. So while that flexibility is great, use it wisely. Okay, So our next schema that we're going to talk about is very similar to Dublin Core. It's based off of Dublin Core. It's called Qualified Dublin Core. It's also known as Dublin Core terms or DC terms. It's an expanded form of Dublin Core that adds a lot of increased and enhanced specificity that is much needed in Dublin Core. And it can also very easily incorporate linked data in elements, which is really important for creating those connections that Xiying was mentioning in that record earlier, like recommending related resources or connecting things more to each other. So expanding that network of materials and connections that a user can make to certain things. So adding that linked data is something that is enhanced in qualified Dublin Core. A system that uses a good example of a system that uses qualified Dublin Core is Content DM. And that is a system that a lot of you or some of you are probably using for digital collections. So that one does allow for qualified Dublin Core to be used. So as I mentioned, qualified Dublin Core does allow for some additional granularity. And the way that it does that is the use of something called DC terms, and which is also what qualified Dublin Core can be called. And these terms add some of that granularity that's missing in those general 15 elements that are included in Dublin Core. So you can add something, so you can add an alternate title or a subtitle to something. You can add an abstract or like more specific labels to like a description. You can add more specificity like access rights or to contributors. It helps you distinguish coverage. So coverage is a tricky field because it encompasses both temporal coverage, which is the time span that an item covers, like World War II, but it also encompasses geographic coverage, so like a location. So coverage can be a tricky field to use consistently because it encompasses both of those things. So DC terms helps us add a little bit more of that granularity there to help resolve some of that, some of those issues with the broad nature of the basic 15 Dublin Core items. So we're going to look at a QDC record. So you can see kind of the difference between how granular you can get here and the previous record that we looked at. So this is for the same item, right? So we see the same title from the previous item here. But we also were able to add an alternative title using the DC terms alternative here, included in the title heading. So the alternative title for this item is the UK Office for Library and Information Networking, which is what this acronym stands for. So that gives us some additional information about this item that we didn't have in the previous version of this record. Additionally, we see under publisher, or beneath the publisher term, we have DC terms is part of, and that allows us to add a relationship here that we didn't have in the previous record as well. We also have a more specified date here. So this item was last modified on this date. So we don't just have to stick to the original publication date. We can add some relationships there and some additional information and some labels that help us understand what this date means in this record. So I hope this helps clear up kind of the difference between simple Dublin Core and qualified Dublin Core, and why the DC terms helps add some much needed structure to the 15 elements that are included in Dublin Core that can be a little bit unwieldy if you're not using them consistently, or you're not able to add these labels to them when you're creating your metadata. Okay, we're going to quickly talk about mods because I'm realizing what time it is. So mods is maintained by the Library of Congress. It is based off of Mark. So it's going to be pretty familiar to those of you who do cataloging. It's very Mark-like, but it's a lot simpler than Mark. It doesn't use the codes, and it's easier to use than Mark is. It's also encoded in XML, like Dublin Core can be, but it doesn't have as many other encoding options as Dublin Core. It follows many of the cataloging standards and conventions, and it allows for authority attributes in a lot of its elements. It's more granular than Dublin Core and qualified Dublin Core, but it still offers a lot of flexibility in that granularity. You have a lot of options when it comes to where you want something or how you want to attribute something in mods. And again, there's that link to the Library of Congress standards. So I'm going to show you an example of mods. It's a lot longer than the other ones, so I couldn't fit it on a slide. This is an example provided by the Library of Congress. So again, this is an XML. So it can look a little scary, but you are going to have a lot of these simple labels that are going to help you read these records. So one of the nice things about mods is it has an element, it has an attribute. You can associate control vocabularies to those attributes. Then it has the value associated with that element. So what we see here is the role. The role is the element that lives under name. That's the main element. This is the attribute. So this is a personal name. And then this is the actual value. So the person's name that we're including here. And then we have that granular ability to assign a role to this person, to this name. So this person's role associated in this record is photographer. And that allows us, unlike Dublin Core, to associate a relationship to this object, how this person is associated with the object. Of course, we have things like the format. So this is type of resource, but we can get a little more granular with some of our authorities. So we're using, I think this is Getty, and this is Jellison Silverprint. So it allows you to use those authorities pretty seamlessly when it comes to incorporating those in your records. We also have things like date issued. That's the year it was created. And, you know, it's just, and then we have, we're able to incorporate a temporal coverage area under subject here. So this was created between the 1960s and 70s. So this is just an example of how Mark can be more granular and how its structure is a lot more hierarchical that allows for that more structured record with some flexibility on how you apply the different excuse me, with how you apply the different kinds of attributes and the different stipulations for those attributes. So let me go back to our presentation. If anyone is interested in seeing additional examples for different content types, that was for a photo. It was the shortest Mark record example that the Library of Congress had, so that's why I used that one. But you can see examples for other content types at this site if you're interested in looking at additional examples. So the benefits of mods are that it allows for granularity in a way that those other schemas don't. It makes for easier converting of records to Mark for use in an ILS or a discovery system. Because it is based off of Mark, it's a lot easier to map that over and include a lot of those same fields that Mark incorporates. It's a very, very well documented schema. You can go down a huge rabbit hole of Mark documentation for days and days if you really wanted to. So it is a very well documented, very widely used in libraries. It has a very high compatibility with existing resource descriptions. It's less detailed than Mark, so various internal record elements that can be mapped to mods. So again, it is very compatible with Mark. And item descriptions from outside, like in Dublin Core or other simple formats, can be mapped and enhanced using mods. Very often, in systems that use mods, it also does produce a Dublin Core record for you that can be shared as well and mapped very easily. So some of the limitations of mods includes that it's a very complex system to use. Again, being familiar with authorities, understanding the different attributes that you can assign to something. The Library of Congress does a very good job in the documentation of breaking down each element so that you can identify those different pieces of each one. And because it is based on MARC and Library of Congress maintains it, it's not very widely used outside of libraries. So that's another limitation, but it does translate well to other schemas. So they can be used outside of libraries pretty well. Some other schemas that are commonly used in digital libraries that we aren't talking about today are METS and DRA. METS allows for additional structure in records. So it's really good for things like books. Some things that have multiple pages, it allows you to keep that structure in your system. And then VRA Core is specifically used for images and artwork. And it's used a lot in museums and in fields that are based on imagery. So we aren't talking about those today, but I did provide some resources for you to check out on those if you're interested, or if your collections contain a lot of those types of items. So here are some additional resources for your reference. We do have another webinar related to creating shareable metadata that goes into more detail on some of these elements that we weren't able to get into. We have some metadata participation guidelines that provide guidance on how to use each element, and then some documentation from the ones that we talked about, as well as some literature that you can reference. Here are some upcoming events that we have. We are going to have a part 2 for this that is going to go into more specific elements and how to write metadata for specific content types like photos or scrapbooks or things like that. That's going to be November 30th, so do check that out if you're interested in that. You can find all of those events on our website. And that's it. So does anyone have any questions now that I've probably rattled your brains with schemas? Mods better suited in archives? So in archives, they actually use something called EAD to structure finding aids. Generally, mods is not used in archives. It's used in digital collections because it allows for that granular description. Archival description tends to be broader than digital library descriptions. So it's not generally used in archives. It is used to describe archival material in digital libraries, but it isn't generally used in archives. And the reason for that is in digital libraries, you're generally describing a specific item versus in a finding aid, you're describing a whole collection or a whole box of something. So you don't need that granularity necessarily in the archives. Any other questions? Okay, well, feel free to email us if you think of any questions, or if as you're working on your metadata, something is stumping you, feel free to reach out to either of us with questions. We also have a metadata working group email that you can send questions to about metadata creation or metadata schemas. And that is a large group of experts that can help answer your question related to metadata. So feel free to send an email there as well, or join that group if you're interested in metadata creation. I would like to take this time to thank Xiying for her time today and her expertise and sharing her expertise with us. Please do join her and I again on November 30th for part 2. And I hope everyone has a great day.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Keila. Talk to everyone next time, hopefully. Bye, everyone.